In today's episode, Dr. Craig tries to prove that atheists can't have objective morals. But unfortunately for him, he not only ends up proving that objective morals don't exist for nobody, he also exposes the fundamental equivocation fallacy that lies at the heart of the moral argument for God. Hey there, folks. Bertram, the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. And we're currently working our way through Dr. Craig's presentation of the argument from morality, and specifically premise 1 of the argument, which claims that objective moral values and duties cannot exist without God. He's tried to make a number of arguments in favor of this premise, none of which has actually explained morality, as well as the simple observation that in any given society, there's certain behaviors that's going to prove to be pro-social and certain behaviors that's going to be anti-social. And since the pro-social behaviors benefit everybody, we set our standards of good to favor the pro-social behaviors and bad to discourage the anti-social ones. With or without any God, that's just how societies is going to work. But of course, there's always folks that's going to want to hijack the mechanisms of morality in order to impose their own standards of behavior in ways that benefit themselves at the expense of other folks. And since they can't justify these arbitrary standards practically, they's going to attribute them to an invisible and unfalsifiable deity so they don't need to justify them. And that's how we end up here, listening to a Christian apologist trying to convince us that morality has to come from his particular God imposing his particular moral standards, and we all supposedly has to listen to him as if he was one of God's duly appointed representatives. But that ain't been working out too well for Dr. Craig once we start cross-examining his arguments. And in fact, his response to the Euthyphro dilemma was so bad it took the whole last episode to cover everything that was wrong with it. And even then, we didn't get to it all. So, yeah, pretty bad. And today, well, let's just say don't get your hopes up. Quote, Plato thought that the good just exists on its own as a sort of self-existent idea. If you find this difficult to grasp, join the company. So atheists might say that moral values like justice, mercy, love, and so on just exist without any foundation. We can call this view atheistic moral Platonism. End quote. So notice, first of all, that Dr. Craig don't say that Plato's notion is silly or wrong. He just says that a lot of folks find it difficult, which is understandable considering how foundational Plato's philosophy is to later Christian theology and metaphysics. The name for Plato's philosophy is idealism, but don't let the name fool you. We ain't talking about idealism in the sense of some kind of unjustified optimism or unrealistic expectations. Plato believed that behind everything that exists, there's a metaphysical ideal to which that thing corresponds, the typical example being a chair. What is it that makes a chair a chair? Plato would say that somewhere in the metaphysical universe there exists an ideal chair. Not an actual literal physical chair, but just the perfect idea of a chair. So this word ideal in this case comes directly from the word idea. According to Plato, chairs is chairs because they gets their chairness from the ideal chair. And we can apply this same kind of thinking to moral values. Earthly justice is only justice to the degree that it corresponds to the metaphysical ideal of justice, and likewise mercy and love and so on. This is the actual correct definition of objective morality. If in these metaphysical ideals for all of the good qualities we call morality that exist independently of any person's perceptions and thoughts, then there are indeed objective moral values and duties, just like Dr. Craig claims. The problem for Dr. Craig, of course, is that if these ideals exist in and of themselves independent of any person, including any divine person, then moral values and duties don't need any God in order to exist. And that's why Dr. Craig adds the word atheistic to the phrase moral Platonism, even though Plato weren't an atheist. It's a bogus addition because moral Platonism ain't atheistic. It don't deny the existence of any god or gods, it just makes the gods irrelevant to the question of where moral values and duties come from. But of course, Dr. Craig can't be having with that. Quote, first, atheistic moral Platonism seems unintelligible. It's easy to understand what it means to say that some person is just, but it's bewildering when somebody says that in the absence of any people, justice itself exists. Moral values seem to be properties of persons, and it's hard to understand how justice can exist as an abstraction. End quote. And for once, Dr. Craig gets it exactly correct. In fact, he's too correct because he's pointing out how nonsensical the whole idea of objective moral values really is. Moral values is a perception of the person who holds them, which means moral values is subjective. We ain't even got to premise 2 yet, which claims that objective moral values exist, and here Dr. Craig has gone on ahead and proved that not only do they not exist, but the whole idea is incoherent and disconnected from reality. But of course, that's true of objective morality correctly defined. But when Dr. Craig talks about objective morality, he ain't using the correct definition. He means that morality is actually subjective, but God is the subject, and so nobody else's opinion really counts. And yet, here we see him very clearly explaining not only what actual objective morality would be, but also why the whole idea is absurd. So it ain't that he's mistaken about the nature of objective morality, which kind of suggests that his misuse of the term ain't any kind of accidental obfuscation. Anyways, now that Dr. Craig has demonstrated the absurdity of objective moral values, atheist or otherwise, it's time to move on to objective moral duties. Quote, second, this view provides no basis for moral duties. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that moral values like justice, loyalty, mercy, forbearance, and the like just exist. How does that result in any moral obligations for me? End quote. And once again, Dr. Craig is not just correct, he's too correct. The whole idea of objective moral duties is just as nonsensical as objective moral values. Of course, Plato could easily claim that ideal moral duties exist in precisely the same way as ideal moral values. But Dr. Craig's criticism still applies. If they exist somewhere out there in some woo-woo metaphysical universe, and would be there even if we didn't exist, then they ain't really got anything to do with us. They's completely independent of us. And again, the objective moral duties that Dr. Craig is debunking ain't atheistic objective moral duties. They's objective moral duties, full stop. Whether objective moral duties exist has nothing to do with whether or not any gods exist. The problem here ain't that objective moral duties is atheistic, it's that they's incoherent and don't do nothing to explain real-world morality. Of course, Dr. Craig wants to deny that and claim that atheism is the problem. Quote, atheistic moral Platonism, lacking a moral lawgiver, has no grounds for moral obligation. End quote. But theistic moral Platonism would have the same problem, even with a moral lawgiver. Just because somebody tries to impose an arbitrary set of moral standards on us don't mean we's under any actual moral obligations to submit to them, especially if the person in question claims moral authority based on a tautological and self-referential definition of morality like God supposedly does. Because according to Dr. Craig, God's nature is good, and good means whatever's defined by God's nature. And that's a tautology. It don't actually define nothing. It's just a self-reference. It's like defining the word difficult as meaning something hard, and hard as meaning something difficult. There ain't no actual definition there. But the bigger problem here is that if in moral standards is imposed by a moral lawgiver, then that ain't objective morality. Even supposing objective moral values and duties existed, if we's getting our morality from a moral lawgiver, then we ain't getting them from the objective moral values and duties. In other words, Dr. Craig is actually proving a whole lot more here than he really wants to. His first premise is that objective moral values and duties can't exist without God. But if they's irrelevant anyway, who cares whether or not they exist? It all comes back to the fact that when Dr. Craig says objective moral values and duties, he don't really mean objective moral values and duties, because he don't believe any such thing is even coherent, let alone real. When he says objective moral values and duties, he means moral values and duties that's imposed on folks by the Christian God. Of course, he can't say that because then his first premise becomes moral values and duties imposed by God cannot exist without God. And of course they can't. His whole argument is based on defining moral values and duties as things that's imposed by God and then using misleading language to cover up the fact that he's really using that definition. But he's got yet one more argument against so-called atheistic moral Platonism, and this time he brings in science. Quote, "Third, it's fantastically improbable that the blind evolutionary process should spit forth precisely that sort of creatures who correspond to the abstractly existing realm of moral values." End quote. And I'll grant Dr. Craig that it would be a surprising coincidence if an unguided evolutionary forces was to produce creatures that exactly matched some set of self-existing metaphysical moral ideals without any apparent connection between them. Well, that's because he's barking up the wrong tree to begin with by assuming that moral values is something external that has to be imposed on humans from the outside. What's entirely unsurprising is that once a species develops empathy and the ability to anticipate the consequences of their actions, the members of that species would learn to favor pro-social behaviors and discourage antisocial ones. Pro-social behaviors not only promote the general good, they also maximize the number of positive interactions that individual members have with each other. And likewise, antisocial behaviors disrupt the general good and maximize negative social interactions. And that's morality in a nutshell. It ain't some mystical, ethereal, metaphysical ideal. It's just a practical consideration of how everybody can get along with one another. No God required. But of course, Dr. Craig wants to stick God in there somehow. Quote, "It's far more plausible to think that both the natural realm and the moral realm are under the authority of a God who gave us both the laws of nature and the moral law, than to think that these two independent realms just happen to mesh." End quote. Now, I'll grant you that a common designer would be more plausible than a coincidental evolution that just happened to match an abstract realm of moral ideals. But that's entirely moot, given that Dr. Craig's argument so far has already proved that no such realm exists. What makes the most sense of all is to say that the realm of moral ideals don't exist in the first place, and therefore it weren't created at all by any god. Dr. Craig thinks he's being clever by making it look like evolution plus morality somehow equals evidence for God, but that argument depends on there being an abstract metaphysical realm of moral ideals, and that's what he just got done debunking. Sadly, though, his audience probably ain't going to notice that. They're going to think that Dr. Craig's arguments against objective morality only applies to atheistic moral ideals, even though his arguments, as stated, apply equally to all objective moral values and duties, theistic or atheistic. And that's just a shame, but what can you do? Next up, what Dr. Craig calls stubborn humanism. Quote, "So what's the atheist to do at this point? Most of them want to affirm the objective reality of moral values and duties." End quote. So let's just hold up right there for a minute and make a comment or two. First of all, don't you just love how Dr. Craig always tries to frame the discussion as if atheists was continually retreating after being forced by apologists to give up their original arguments? He can't just discuss the fact that different atheists has different opinions. He has to set it up as if all the atheists believe the first thing he tried to debunk, and then he talks like he debunked it, and takes the next thing certain atheists believes and pretends that all the atheists had to retreat to this position after he debunked the first one, and on and on and on. It'd almost be funny if it weren't so dang dishonest. But the bigger issue with what he said so far is his claim that most atheists want to say that objective morality exists because there's some shenanigans going on there that has to do with what you mean by objective. When Dr. Craig talks about objective moral values and duties, he kind of equivocates between the actual definition and the specialized definition used by Christian apologists. When he's talking about Platonic moral ideals, he uses the standard definition and says it's nonsense to think of things like justice existing by themselves independently of actual folks. But then he says that atheists want to assert objective moral values and duties, and he's kind of overlapping both meanings of the term objective. On the one hand, he wants it to mean objective moral ideals in the Platonic sense, so he can imply that atheists want something impossible. But on the other hand, that ain't really something that most atheists want. They's just saying that there's more to morality than just the personal opinions of any one single individual, which is the definition of objective that Christian apologists like to use instead of the real definition. And in fact, even in that second definition, there's some equivocation going on, because when apologist says objective morality, what they really mean is moral laws that's imposed on folks by a higher power. So there's equivocating between objective in the sense of something not being a matter of personal opinion and objective in the sense of being imposed by an outside power. And that's kind of the heart of the argument for morality. By equivocating between all the different senses in which the word objective can be used, they can set up a false dichotomy to make it look like either morality is a matter of individual personal opinion, or else it's imposed on us by some kind of higher power. You can see Ray Comfort pulling this kind of stunt all the time, and if folks ain't prepared for it, it can be a pretty effective tactic, sad to say. But let's move on. Dr. Craig claims that atheists want to assert the existence of objective morality, whatever that means, and he continues, quote, "So they simply embrace some sort of humanism and stop there. Whatever contributes to human flourishing is good, and whatever detracts from it is bad, and that's the end of the story." End quote. And once again, Dr. Craig tries to frame the atheist position in a way that looks like atheists is being backed into a corner and has to stop because they ain't got nowhere else to go. But of course, that ain't the case at all, especially the part about the story ending with a simplistic declaration about human flourishing. There's lots more we could talk about here. First of all, human flourishing ain't a bad basis for morality. There's more to the story than that, but at a college 101 level, that's pretty much the gist of it. Morality is an ongoing, evolving struggle of the human species to find a way for everybody to get along in a way that provides the best benefits to each individual member. Human flourishing happens to be a handy and useful benchmark for how well we's doing in that struggle. Antisocial behaviors that provoke conflicts and deprives folks of stuff they need and whatnot is behaviors that's going to detract from human flourishing overall. And conversely, pro-social behaviors that support other folks and help share the workload and provide for their needs is going to promote human flourishing. So as it works out, when we call things good because we like the consequences they produce, we also find that the good things promote human flourishing. And likewise with the things we call bad that turn out to detract from human flourishing. And again, this is something that ain't imposed on us by some kind of higher power. It emerges organically just from individual folks pursuing their own best interests and recognizing that cooperation is the best way to succeed in that pursuit. Of course, this understanding of morality ain't going to make folks happy if they wants to do antisocial stuff like persecuting women and immigrants and LGBT plus folks. If you wants to impose antisocial standards of morality on folks, you ain't going to get there by understanding how real-world morality actually works. For that, you need to fool folks into thinking there's a higher power who's going to be pretty ticked unless we all gets to hating other folks real fast. And for thousands of years, certain religious folks has been doing exactly that. And the icing on the cake is that while they're doing all the hate, They claim that their God deserves the credit for all the good things that comes from promoting human flourishing. Which is kind of what Dr. Craig is doing here. I know he ain't intentionally setting out to make an apologetic for bigotry in the name of God. Officially, he's just trying to use morality as an argument for God's existence, or at least as a creation myth giving God credit for the fact that folks has morals. But you can't separate the moral argument for God from the practical implications of claiming that God dictates what's right and wrong independent of our opinions. It's a power play, an attempt to preempt the conversation and impose dictates arbitrarily, regardless of the consequences, on the grounds that God commands them and therefore they must be, quote unquote, good. And you can see the results in the darker chapters of church history. It's an approach to morality that leads to behavior so bad that modern Christians deny that Christians back then was even real Christians. We'd all be better off if we just discarded that approach completely and went with human flourishing. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Dr. Craig is going to try and find some kind of complaint he can use against human flourishing, but it ain't going to do him no good. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.